June 5, 1944. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Southwick House. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and silence. Maps covered the walls, the English Channel, the Normandy coastline, arrows pointing toward beaches with code names that, by dawn, would be written into history. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood beneath a single hanging lamp, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, thousands of aircraft engines waited in darkness. In harbors across southern England, ships rocked gently in rough seas. 156,000 men were preparing to cross 20 miles of open water toward the most heavily fortified coastline in Europe. If the Germans were ready, it would be a massacre. For weeks, meteorologists had warned of storms. Naval commanders feared heavy surf would drown landing craft before they reached the sand. Field marshals argued over timing, over tides, over moonlight. But weather was not the only uncertainty. Shortly after 9 p.m., a courier entered the room carrying a thin folder. Inside it was not a battle report, not a reconnaissance photograph, but a translation. A German message, intercepted, decrypted, rushed across the English countryside from a quiet estate known as Bletchley Park. Eisenhower opened it slowly. The room did not speak, because the question hanging over the invasion was not whether the Atlantic Wall was strong. Everyone knew it was. The real question was far more dangerous. Were the Germans looking at Normandy, or were they still waiting somewhere else? If Berlin believed the invasion would fall at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, then Hitler's strongest reserves would remain there. If not, panzer divisions could be moving south already. In a matter of hours, one decision would send thousands of men into the surf. And that decision depended not on ships or planes or artillery, but on whether Allied intelligence truly understood what the enemy believed. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside Southwick House, history waited for an answer. By the summer of 1944, the coastline of northern France had been transformed into a fortress. Concrete bunkers rose from the sand like blunt gray teeth. Steel obstacles littered the beaches, angled rails designed to rip open landing craft at low tide. Mines were buried beneath the surf. Artillery batteries were hidden in reinforced casemates, sighted carefully onto every stretch of open water. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months strengthening what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. He understood something many others did not. Air superiority meant little once the enemy was ashore. The invasion had to be stopped at the waterline. If Allied troops gained a foothold, the war in the West might be lost. Behind the beaches waited armored reserves, panzer divisions positioned inland, capable of counterattacking within hours, fast, coordinated, ruthless. If those divisions moved quickly toward Normandy, they could split the beachheads apart before they connected. Landing forces would be isolated, supplies would stall in the surf, thousands of men would be trapped between the sea and German armor. The Allies did not have the luxury of a second attempt. There would be no gradual buildup, no retreat and regrouping. Too many ships, too many men, too much exposure. The first 48 hours would decide everything. And yet, for all the firepower assembled across southern England, none of it could prevent disaster if German command reacted correctly. If Berlin realized Normandy was the true objective, if reserves were released immediately, if armored columns rolled west before Allied forces secured the beaches, then the invasion would collapse under its own ambition, which meant the question inside Southwick House was brutally simple. Not whether the Germans were strong, but whether they were looking in the wrong direction. Because if they were not, then by dawn, the English Channel would be filled with burning ships. But the battle for Normandy did not begin on the beaches. It did not begin with Eisenhower's decision, and it did not begin with the storm clouds gathering over the Channel. To understand why the invasion moved forward that night, why the men inside Southwick House believed the Germans were still looking north, we have to step away from the maps, away from the ships, away from the roar of engines waiting in darkness. We have to travel back several years, far from the front lines, far from France, to a quiet stretch of English countryside. In Buckinghamshire, hidden behind hedgerows and guarded gates, stood a Victorian mansion surrounded by wooden huts. From a distance, it looked harmless, almost forgotten. A country estate requisitioned for wartime administration. But inside those huts, a different kind of war was being fought. No artillery, no tanks, no uniforms splashed with mud, only desks crowded with papers, typewriters clattering through the night, young men and women hunched over strings of seemingly meaningless letters. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles. Yet by 1944, their work would influence every major decision made by the Allied command. Because somewhere in Berlin, German officers believed their communications were secure, encrypted by a machine they considered mathematically unbreakable. They spoke freely across continents, issued orders, moved divisions, debated strategy, confident no one was listening. But in this quiet English estate, someone was, and what they were reading would determine whether thousands of men lived or died on the beaches of Normandy. When war erupted in 1939, Germany possessed a weapon no bomber could carry and no battleship could fire. It sat quietly on desks, small enough to fit inside a wooden case, heavy, mechanical, ordinary. At first glance, the Enigma machine. To the untrained eye, it resembled an oversized typewriter, keys, lamps, rotating wheels hidden beneath a lid. But inside those rotating wheels, called rotors, lay a mathematical labyrinth. Each time a key was pressed, electrical currents passed through a complex wiring system, scrambling a letter into another. With every keystroke, the rotors shifted position, changing the cipher again. A single message could transform into billions upon billions of possible combinations. And at midnight each day, the settings changed. New rotor orders, new plugboard connections, new keys distributed across the German military by secure channels. Even if you captured a machine, even if you understood how it worked, you still faced astronomical odds. German cryptographers were confident, almost arrogant. They believed Enigma was unbreakable. They transmitted everything through it. U-boat positions, stalking convoys in the Atlantic, panzer movements. Across Eastern Europe, Luftwaffe deployments, strategic debates between high command and field marshals, entire campaigns whispered through electricity. And they believed no one was listening. But in Britain, a small group of mathematicians and linguists refused to accept that any human invention was beyond understanding. The first breakthroughs had begun in Poland before the war, when Polish cryptanalysts uncovered early weaknesses in Enigma's design. When their country fell in 1939, they smuggled their knowledge west, first to France, then to Britain. At Bletchley Park, that fragile foundation became something far larger. The estate transformed into a hive of relentless calculation. Civilian recruits arrived in waves, chess champions, crossword prodigies, classicists, engineers, some barely out of university, others eccentric academics pulled from quiet lectures halls. Among them was a young mathematician named Alan Turing, reserved, brilliant, unconventional, Turing. And his colleagues understood that cracking Enigma would not be a matter of guessing. It would require machines, faster than human thought, capable of testing thousands of possible settings at once. So they built them, towering electromechanical devices called bombs. Rows of spinning drums clattered endlessly, day and night, searching for patterns in chaos. The rooms hummed with heat and noise. Operators listened for the subtle click that signaled a possible solution. Most attempts failed. Hours of computation led nowhere. Wrong settings, dead ends, restart. And all the while, German forces advanced across Europe. France collapsed. Britain endured the Blitz. U-boats ravaged Atlantic shipping lanes, sinking vessels faster than they could be replaced. Every day without progress cost lives. But slowly, painfully, the cracks widened. Patterns emerged. Human habits betrayed themselves. Repeated phrases, weather reports, predictable formalities in military language. The impossible began to bend. By 1941 and 1942, Bletchley Park was reading increasing portions of German naval and military traffic. Not perfectly, not continuously, but often enough to matter. Convoys were rerouted away from wolf packs. Submarines were hunted more precisely. Air defenses strengthened before raids. Still, the knowledge carried an unbearable burden. The Allies could not reveal how they knew. If a convoy suddenly avoided every U-boat without explanation, suspicion would fall. If bombs fell too precisely on hidden targets, Berlin would change its encryption systems, so intelligence had to be used sparingly, almost carefully. Every decision weighed against the risk of exposing the secret. By 1944, Enigma was no longer an invincible wall. It was a window. Through it, Allied leaders could glimpse the movement of divisions, the shortages of fuel, the arguments between commanders, even Hitler's own assumptions about Allied strategy. But seeing the enemy's plans was only half the battle, because knowledge alone does not win wars. What mattered now was whether that knowledge could shape what Germany believed was coming next, and that would require something even more dangerous than code-breaking. It would require deception on a scale never before attempted. By 1943, the secret flowing out of Bletchley Park had a name: Ultra. It was the highest classification in the Allied war effort, above top secret, above everything. Only a handful of commanders were permitted to know its source. Even fewer understood how fragile it truly was, because Ultra did not simply provide information, it provided vision. For the first time in modern warfare, one side could read large portions of the other's operational intentions in near real time. German naval signals revealed U-boat patrol lines stretching across the Atlantic. Instead of sailing blindly into wolf packs, Allied convoys were diverted by a few degrees, just enough to slip through, unseen. Submarines that once hunted freely now found destroyers waiting for them. In North Africa, intercepted messages exposed fuel shortages and reinforcement plans. Rommel's movements could be anticipated. Airfields struck before aircraft arrived, supply ships intercepted before they unloaded. To German commanders, it felt as though fate itself had turned against them. Orders arrived too late, plans unraveled mysteriously. Offensive thrusts met resistance that seemed impossibly prepared. They suspected spies. They blamed chance. They never imagined the truth, that their own words were betraying them. But Ultra had limits. Decrypting messages took time. Some days yielded nothing. Others delivered fragments without context, and every use of the intelligence carried risk. If Allied forces reacted too perfectly, if they intercepted every convoy, countered every maneuver, the Germans would know their cipher had been compromised. Enigma settings would change, procedures would tighten. The window would close. So commanders were forced to make terrible calculations, allow some ships to sail into danger, let certain targets remain untouched, sacrifice tactical advantage to protect the secret. It was a war fought not only with weapons, but with restraint. By early 1944, however, Ultra's reach extended deeper than ever before. German troop movements in France, panzer divisions stationed near Paris, defensive construction reports along the Channel coast, internal debates within the High Command. The Allies could now see not just where the German army stood, but what it feared and what it expected. That distinction mattered, because in war, perception shapes deployment. If Berlin believed the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, then its strongest forces would remain there, close to the narrowest crossing, closest to England. If Berlin believed Normandy was merely a diversion, reserves would stay put, reinforcements would hesitate. Ultra began revealing something extraordinary. German intelligence assessments repeatedly warned of an attack at Calais, even after Allied air raids intensified elsewhere, even after reconnaissance flights probed different coastlines. The expectation did not shift. And within that expectation lay opportunity. Because if the Allies could not only read German thinking, but reinforce it, then the invasion of Europe might succeed before the first landing craft ever touched sand. What began as code-breaking was becoming something far more ambitious. It was becoming a weapon aimed directly at the enemy's mind. By early 1944, the Allies faced a brutal reality. Even with air superiority, even with naval dominance, even with ultra-revealing German dispositions, an amphibious invasion of France would be obvious. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of supplies gathering along the southern coast of England. The largest military buildup in history could not be hidden. The Germans would know an invasion was coming. The only question was where. And that question would decide the fate of Europe. The narrowest point between England and France lay at Pas-de-Calais. Barely 20 miles across the channel, close enough for artillery to imagine reaching, logical, efficient, expected. German planners had always believed the main Allied landing would strike there, which meant the strongest German formation in Western Europe, the 15th Army, was stationed near Calais. Infantry divisions dug in, coastal guns fortified, armored reserves positioned within rapid striking distance. Normandy, by comparison, was considered less likely. Its beaches were wider, its ports less convenient, its approach more complicated. But less likely was not the same as ignored. If German command suspected Normandy was the true objective, even briefly, those reserves could move. So Allied planners made a radical decision. They would not merely hide the invasion. They would invent another one. Operation Fortitude. An elaborate deception campaign designed to convince Hitler that the real blow would fall at Calais, even after landings began elsewhere. Across southeastern England, phantom armies took shape. Inflatable tanks were arranged in open fields, wooden aircraft stood in neat rows along fake airstrips, dummy landing craft filled harbors. Entire divisions existed only on paper, complete with falsified supply records and carefully crafted insignia. At the center of this illusion stood General George S. Patton, aggressive, charismatic, known to the Germans as America's most capable field commander. Publicly sidelined after a disciplinary scandal, Patton was reassigned to command the entirely fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG. To German intelligence, it appeared unmistakable. Patton was preparing to lead the main assault across the shortest route to France, and the deception did not rely on props alone. Double agents, some of them trusted by Berlin for years, fed carefully timed misinformation through controlled channels. Radio operators transmitted fake traffic around the clock, simulating divisions that did not exist. Reconnaissance flights were encouraged to observe the carefully staged buildup. Every false signal was designed to reinforce what German command already believed. Calais was the logical target. Calais was inevitable. Ultra intercepts soon revealed the impact. German intelligence assessments continued to warn of an invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Even as Allied bombers struck Normandy rail lines, even as reconnaissance intensified along other stretches of coastline, the deception held. But it was fragile. If even one critical piece unraveled, if a double agent was exposed, if reconnaissance detected the emptiness behind the illusion would collapse. And there was one man who threatened to see through it: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Unlike many in Berlin, Rommel understood Allied air power. He believed the invasion would come soon and that it could strike anywhere. He pushed for armored divisions to be placed closer to the coast. He argued that waiting inland would be fatal. If Rommel convinced Hitler to shift those reserves toward Normandy before the landings, the beaches would become killing grounds. In late May 1944, Ultra intercepted urgent German communications. The 15th Army remained near Calais. Defensive construction there intensified. Reports emphasized the threat of invasion at the narrow crossing. But debates simmered within the high command. Some officers questioned whether Normandy might be more than a diversion. The deception was working. But it required one final test. Would Germany continue to believe in Calais, even after Allied troops began landing somewhere else? June 5, 1944. The storm over the channel had forced a delay. High winds churned the sea, landing craft. Crews fought nausea in crowded holds. Paratroopers sat in silence beside their gear, waiting for the order that would send them into darkness. Inside Bletchley Park, the machines did not pause for weather. Rotors spun. Paper strips spilled from decrypting units. Operators leaned over fresh intercepts pulled from German radio traffic across northern France. Time mattered now, in minutes, not days. Shortly after nightfall, a new message broke through. It came from German high command. The translation was rushed south to Southwick House. It confirmed what Allied planners had hoped, but never fully dared to assume. The 15th Army remained in place near Pas-de-Calais. Armored divisions were not redeploying toward Normandy. Reports from German field units continued to warn of a major assault at the narrow crossing. Even more critical, Hitler had not released the panzer reserves under his personal control. In Berlin, The expectation of a second, larger invasion still dominated strategic thinking. Normandy was being interpreted as a diversion. In the early hours of June 6th, as Allied aircraft engines roared to life and paratroopers lifted into the night sky, German command remained uncertain. Some officers demanded immediate reinforcement of the western beaches. Others hesitated, convinced the true blow had yet to fall. And at the center of that hesitation stood the deception. For the men inside Southwick House, the intercepts provided something no battlefield commander ever truly possesses, not certainty of victory, but certainty of confusion. And in war, confusion can be as decisive as firepower. Shortly after 4 a.m., June 5th, the senior commanders gathered inside the map room at Southwick House. The weather charts were grim: cloud cover, heavy seas, narrow windows of visibility. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory worried about catastrophic losses among the airborne divisions. Naval officers warned that high surf could swamp landing craft before they ever reached the sand. The room was heavy with doubt. Eisenhower listened. He'd already postponed the invasion once. Every delay risked discovery. Hundreds of thousands of men were poised on a razor's edge between secrecy and exposure. If the Armada lingered too long in English ports, German reconnaissance might detect the buildup shifting. But the final intercepts lay on the table. German reserves were still positioned near Pas-de-Calais. Panzer divisions remained under Hitler's direct authority. No large-scale redeployment toward Normandy had begun. The deception was holding. The Germans were waiting for an invasion that would never come. Silence settled over the room. Eisenhower looked around at the faces of the men who would carry the weight of what followed. Then he spoke quietly. "Okay, let's go." It was not a dramatic declaration, not a speech for history books, just 4 words. With them, the largest amphibious invasion ever. Attempted moved from planning to reality. Within hours, thousands of ships would turn toward France, and the fate of Europe would ride not only on courage and firepower, but on whether the enemy continued to believe the wrong story. Just after midnight on June 6th, the sky above Normandy filled with aircraft. Engines droned through low clouds as paratroopers prepared to jump into darkness. Red and green lights flickered inside transport planes. Below them, the French countryside lay silent, unaware that thousands of men were descending through the night. Hours later, the horizon at sea began to glow. An armada stretched across the channel: battleships, destroyers, transports, landing craft, more vessels than the world had ever seen assembled for a single operation. Naval guns opened fire before dawn. The coastline erupted in flashes of orange and white. Concrete bunkers shuddered under bombardment. Smoke drifted across the beaches. Then the ramps dropped. At Omaha, men waded into water heavy with equipment. Machine gun fire tore through the surf. Landing craft burned. Medics crawled between bodies pinned behind steel obstacles. The sand became chaos. At Utah, confusion scattered units inland. At Gold and Juneau, resistance stiffened in pockets. At Sword, German counterattacks threatened to split the line. The invasion was not clean. It was not easy. It was violent, disorganized, and desperate. But even as the fighting raged, messages continued to travel through German command networks. Reports described landings along the Normandy coast. Requests for immediate armored reinforcement followed. And then came the hesitation. High command debated whether this was the main assault or a diversion. Field reports warned of a second, larger landing still expected at Pas-de-Calais. The 15th Army remained in position. Panzer divisions under Hitler's authority were not fully released at once. Precious hours slipped away. By the time German and the reserves began moving in strength toward Normandy, Allied forces had secured footholds inland. Beachheads connected. Reinforcements poured ashore. The deception had survived first contact. As soldiers fought yard by yard through hedgerows and villages, the larger truth became clear. The Germans had not responded with immediate overwhelming force. They had waited. And in war, waiting can be fatal. On the beaches of Normandy, survival in those first brutal hours depended on many things: courage, sacrifice, relentless firepower. But it also depended on confusion. and confusion had been engineered months before a single soldier set foot on French sand. By nightfall, on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were in Allied hands. Not securely, not peacefully, but firmly enough. More than 156,000 troops had crossed the Channel. Thousands lay dead or wounded along the sand. Entire units had been shattered in the surf. Others had pushed inland through smoke and hedgerows, clinging to fragile ground that would soon become the foothold for the liberation of Europe. To the world, D-Day would be remembered as a gamble of unimaginable scale, a bold stroke, a leap of faith, a storming of fortress Europe against impossible odds. But for decades, one critical truth remained hidden. The invasion had not been blind. In the weeks that followed, German command continued to hold substantial forces near Pas-de-Calais. Even after Normandy was clearly the main battlefield, Hitler remained convinced that a second, larger assault might still come at the narrow crossing. Ultra intercepts confirmed it. The 15th Army waited. Armored divisions that might have crushed the beachheads in the first 48 hours stayed in place far longer than they should have. The deception endured even after the first shots were fired. And yet, none of this could be celebrated. The existence of Ultra remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The men and women at Bletchley Park returned quietly to civilian life. Their work was classified, their achievements unspoken. Families never knew what they had done. The world saw ships and soldiers. It did not see the spinning rotors, the clattering bombs, the sleepless nights over coded fragments of German doubt. It did not see the moment inside Southwick House when a thin folder of intercepted messages helped tip the balance of history. Wars are often remembered for courage at the front, and rightly so. But sometimes victory is decided long before the first shot is fired. On June 6, 1944, the greatest weapon the Allies possessed was not a battleship or a bomber. It was knowledge, the ability to read an enemy's mind, and the discipline to make him believe the wrong story. If you found this story worth remembering, consider supporting the channel. It helps us continue telling the hidden stories that shaped the Second World War. Because some victories were fought in shadows, and without them, the light of liberation might never have reached the shores of Europe.